Hey everyone, before we dive into today's stories, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It'll really help you get more thrilling and spine-chilling stories like this. I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below, and let's see how far our story listeners reach. The rain had been falling for 50 hours. Not the gentle, cleansing mountain rain, but a relentless, cold, hammering assault that sounded like gravel hitting the metal roof of my cabin. I'd retreated up here a month ago, seeking silence after everything. The kind of silence where the world can't find you. But the silence was gone, replaced by the roar of the storm and the ever-present, terrifying sound of the creek. It wasn't a creek anymore. It was a chocolate-brown torrent, swollen and angry, threatening to wash out the narrow dirt road that was my only connection to civilization. I had maybe 20 feet of clearance between my porch and the water, and it was shrinking fast. I was pacing the small cabin, nursing a cup of stale black coffee, when the power finally died. The lights flickered once, a pathetic yellow sigh, and then plunged me into absolute darkness. I fumbled for the thick glass lantern on the shelf and got it lit. The oil lamp cast dancing shadows, turning the familiar wood walls into something ancient and foreign. That's when I heard the sound. It was below the roar of the wind and the rush of the water. It was subtle, but once I focused on it, I couldn't unhear it. Thump, thump, pause, thump. It was rhythmic, too regular to be a branch hitting a rock, too deep to be an animal. It was coming from the direction of the creek, right where the water was highest. I checked my watch. 1:17 a.m. My nerves, already frayed by weeks of isolation and the endless rain, were stretched tight. What kind of sound keeps a perfect rhythm in a raging flood? I told myself it was debris, a loose log caught in the current, battering a submerged foundation. But the pattern was too distinct, too deliberate. Thump, thump, thump. I put on my heaviest canvas coat and waterproof boots. I grabbed the lantern, leaving the cabin door ajar to let the light guide me back. Stepping out onto the porch was like walking into a cold, wet wall. The rain instantly soaked through my jeans. I had to cut my hand around the lantern's chimney to keep the flame from drowning. I edged carefully down the slippery bank toward the creek. The light beam struggled against the sheets of water, illuminating a chaos of churning mud, snapping branches, and foam. And the sound was louder here. Much louder. It felt like it was coming from a specific point. Maybe 10 feet upstream, near the cluster of black walnut trees that marked the old property line. Thump, thump. I crept closer to the edge, the ground soft and yielding under my boots. I held the lantern out over the rushing water, peering into the chaos. I didn't see a log, I didn't see a machine. I saw a shape. It was black, massive, and partially submerged in the deepest part of the current. It looked like the trunk of a giant tree, except it was perfectly smooth and strangely geometric. It was rocking violently in the current, and every time it pitched back, the far end would strike a flat, embedded slab of shale rock on the bank. Thump. It was the source of the rhythm. Relief washed over me, brief and sharp. It was just a massive piece of debris. But as the object rolled slightly in the fierce current, the lantern light caught a detail that made my breath seize in my throat. It wasn't wood, it was metallic, and there were rivets. Dozens of them, running in neat parallel lines down the side of the cylindrical shape. It looked less like a log and more like a massive rusted barrel or tank. And it had a door, a hatch built into the side, sealed with heavy clamps. The rhythm suddenly stopped. The object settled, jammed firmly between two boulders, its long side exposed to the bank. I moved closer, fighting the suction of the mud. I needed to see what it was. An old septic tank? An industrial drum washed down from an upstream mill? The side of the tank facing me was coated in algae and river muck, but across the surface, scratched deeply into the metal, was a word. It looked hastily done, almost frantic. The word was trap. My mind recoiled. A trap? Who would scrawl a warning on a discarded tank? Then the hair stood up on the back of my neck. I heard something that was not the rain and not the creek. It was a whisper. Faint, high-pitched, and clearly coming from inside the tank. The whisper wasn't a word. It was a choked, agonizing sound, like someone trying desperately to draw breath through mud. My whole body went cold. There was something alive in there. Something trapped and drowning. I dropped to my knees, frantic. The clamps. The hatch. I shone the light on the nearest clamp. It was rusted solid, the metal fused together by time and water. There was no way to open it without heavy machinery. I screamed, "Hey, can you hear me?" The sound was instantly lost in the wind. The only reply was the faint, desperate, choked breathing sound from inside the metal cylinder. I scrambled backwards, my hands covered in muck. I had to get a tool, something, anything. As I turned to run back to the cabin, the creek gave a massive groaning surge. The ground beneath the walnut trees gave way, and the water level rose a solid foot in seconds, reaching my knees. The tank began to roll again, breaking free of the boulders. It tumbled, end over end, further into the main current. As it rolled, the light of my lantern caught the hatch one last time, and this time I saw what was covering the peephole slit on the door. It wasn't a lid. It was a single, terrified, staring human eye. The tank spun, taking the screaming eye with it, and was instantly swallowed by the black current. The rhythmic thumping was replaced by a churning, chaotic silence. I stood there, hip deep in the freezing, rising water, holding the useless lantern. I hadn't saved anyone. I hadn't even helped. I had only confirmed a horror. I stumbled back to the porch, my mind racing. A large, sealed metal container marked trap, carrying a living human prisoner, washed downriver by a flood. Was this a crime, or was it survival? Did someone put that person in there to save them from the rising waters, or to silence them? I ran into the cabin, my adrenaline spiking. I had to call for help, but the power was out, and my emergency satellite phone was in the truck, parked a quarter-mile up the dirt road, right where the current was weakest. I snatched the keys and the lantern. I opened the door to leave, but before I could step out, my light caught a detail I had missed earlier. Scratched into the wooden sill of my own cabin door, fresh and unmistakable, were the same deep, frantic marks I had seen on the metal tank. And below the marks, scrawled into the soft wood, was a single cryptic symbol, a jagged, inverted triangle. My eyes darted to the rising creek, then to the scratches on my door. How did the person in the tank know where I lived? And if they were trapped in the river, who was here right now, scratching on my door? The thought was a physical blow. Someone else was out there in the storm, and they had been here, waiting for me to leave. I slammed the door shut and slid the deadbolt. The roar of the creek suddenly felt much, much closer. I stared into the darkness, hearing nothing but the drumming rain, and the sickening fear that whatever I had just witnessed was only the first warning. I hated the toll road. It wasn't the $5 I minded, it was the man who took it. My job was simple, caretaker for the Caldwell family's summer cabin, 20 miles deep in the remote Maine mountains. It was October, the leaves were gone, and the season was over. I was up there for the last check, winterizing the plumbing, setting the mouse traps, and making sure the security system was armed. The only way in or out was the old logging road, now a privately maintained, single-lane gravel path, and the only person who monitored it was old Silas at the toll booth. I made the drive up in the early afternoon, so the day was relatively bright, though the fog was already starting to hug the peaks. Silas was in his tiny, leaning shack, a cloud of pipe smoke escaping the broken window. He looked up as my truck rolled to a stop, his eyes narrow slits under the brim of a greasy tweed cap. "Back again, young Jack," he rasped, his voice like gravel. "Thought you finished up last week." "Plumbing issue, Silas. Quick job, be down before sunset." I handed him a $5 bill. He took the money, but he didn't raise the rickety wooden arm. His eyes weren't looking at me, they were looking past me into the truck bed. "Didn't see the Caldwells this year. Nice folk." He paused. "Got a fellow trying to rent out the old Tucker place, 2 miles past your turnoff. Says he's a writer. Don't look like a writer." "A lot of things don't look like what they are, Silas. Let me through." I forced a small laugh. He finally raised the arm with a creak that matched his joints. "Be careful on the return, Jack. Fog's coming in heavy, and..." He leaned down, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "Keep an eye out for a hiker. Tall fella, maybe 30. Black backpack. Said he was headed to the old fire tower. That was 3 days ago. Hasn't come back down yet. Could be lost, or worse." My gut clenched. The fire tower was miles beyond the Caldwell place, deep in the state land. "You report it?" "Ain't my job. I just take the toll. But you're heading right past where he turned off. Just keep your eyes open." I nodded, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Silas never gave a damn about anyone. Why the sudden neighborly warning? I finished the work by 9 p.m. The sun had set 2 hours ago, and the temperature had plummeted. The fog had rolled in so thick it felt like driving through milk. Headlights were useless, they just reflected the mist back into my eyes. I was crawling along the gravel road, 10 minutes from the Caldwell Gate, when I saw it. It wasn't a dead deer or a fallen branch. It was a backpack, a modern, expensive black hiking pack, half submerged in a rain puddle by the side of the road. I pulled over and killed the engine. The only sound was the drip of water from the pine branches and the fast, shallow thump of my heart. The air was heavy, damp, and perfectly silent. I knew I shouldn't touch it. I knew I should keep driving. But the image of Silas's face, the strange urgency in his warning, made me step out into the cold night. I shone my work light on the pack. There was a slash on the side, a clean tear, and a small reddish-brown stain soaking into the nylon near the zipper. I knelt, reaching out, and noticed the ground around the pack. The mud was deeply churned, not by a vehicle, but by feet. A lot of back-and-forth movement, frantic and clumsy. As I scanned the area with my light, it caught on a glint of metal about 20 feet into the trees. I pushed through the brush, my boots silent on the carpet of wet moss and pine needles. It was a wallet, leather, soaked and ruined, lying face up next to a massive granite boulder. I picked it up. Inside, the laminated driver's license was pristine. The name, Ethan Vance, age 32. He was the hiker Silas warned me about. But what was tucked behind the license, held in place by years of wear, wasn't a credit card. It was a heavily folded newspaper clipping, yellowed and fragile. I unfolded it carefully. It was an old article from a city paper dated 6 months prior. The headline screamed, "Vital witness flees before trial, key testimony in state fraud case lost." Ethan Vance, a witness, a fugitive maybe. And Silas knew he was coming up this road. He knew he was missing, and he made sure I knew it too. Why warn me unless Silas was involved? Was he checking to see if I was looking for Vance, or if I was one of the people chasing him? I shoved the wallet and the clipping into my jacket pocket and scrambled back to the road. I had to get out of there. I had to get to a phone and call the police, not for a lost hiker, but for a witness who was clearly stopped and potentially hurt on this road. I jumped back into the truck, slammed the door, and fumbled for the keys in the ignition. That's when I saw it. On the dashboard, right next to the steering wheel, was a single freshly sharpened pencil. I hadn't left a pencil there. I don't use pencils. I stared at it, a knot of pure panic tightening in my stomach. The pencil was resting on a small, folded scrap of paper. I picked up the note, the rough paper scratching my trembling fingers. The message, written in a neat, careful script that looked startlingly similar to Silas's old-fashioned handwriting, contained just 5 words. "You didn't check the fog." Someone had been in the truck. Someone was watching me. Not just watching me search, but watching me stop. I looked into the fog where the light faded to nothing. How close were they? Did they follow me up, or were they waiting for me to leave? I slammed the key into the ignition, the engine roaring to life, and threw the truck into drive. I didn't care about the mud or the potholes. I drove as fast as the road would allow, barreling down the mountain. The thought hammered in my head. Silas let me through, knowing a witness was missing. He warned me about the hiker, then secretly planted a warning note in my truck. Silas wasn't the guardian of the toll road. He was the gatekeeper for something much worse. He was checking off who went up and who came down, making sure no one interfered with whatever happened to Ethan Vance. I ripped around a tight bend, tires spitting gravel. The fog was finally starting to thin out as I reached the valley floor. And then I saw the lights. Not the single, low yellow glow of Silas's shack, but 3 sets of headlights, angled across the road, blocking my path 50 yards ahead. They were huge, dark trucks, the kind contractors use. I slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded sideways, stopping just shy of the blockade. In the middle of the road, standing in the glare of the high beams, was Silas. He wasn't wearing his tweed cap, and in his hand, he wasn't holding a pipe. He was holding a large, pump-action shotgun, pointed directly at my windshield. He smiled, a wide, empty smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Thought you might be a little fast on the way down, Jack," he called out over the idling engines. "You seemed real interested in that hiker I mentioned. Found his little backpack, did you?" My heart was a jackhammer against my ribs. "I'm calling the police, Silas. I found his wallet." Silas chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "No, you're not, because you're going to tell me where you found his wallet, and then we're going to talk about who else knows what you know." Three figures detached themselves from the shadows behind the trucks. They were big, silent men, moving with a controlled, predatory patience. They were carrying flashlights, and they were walking toward my truck. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I had the wallet, the newspaper clipping, the proof, in my jacket pocket, and I was trapped between a blockade and the memory of a missing witness and a bloody backpack. How many people had Silas stopped for over the years? And was there any way I could use the pencil note he left me against him to buy myself 1 second of escape? I put the truck in reverse, throwing one last, desperate glance at the pitch-black woods surrounding me. The fog was my best friend and my worst enemy. It had rolled in off the open plains just after midnight, thick and cold, smelling of wet earth and winter wheat. It was perfect cover. You couldn't see 10 feet in front of you, but it also turned every snapped twig and every muffled sound into a physical threat. I was 300 yards off the road, crawling on my belly through dried, brittle corn stalks that cut into my hands even through my gloves. The target, the old Reddick farm. Abandoned since the 60s, except for the massive, slate-roofed barn. The rumor in the small-time circuit was that Old Man Reddick, a notorious bootlegger, had stashed a dozen crates of WWI-era German weapons in that barn's root cellar, right before he disappeared. I finally reached the back of the barn, a huge black silhouette against the slightly less black sky. The wood was rotten, the paint peeling away like dead skin. I stood up, brushing the dirt off my knees, and pulled out my lock-picking kit. The main door's padlock was laughably old. I had the tumblers turned and the shackle open in under a minute. I pushed the heavy wooden door inward, and the sound it made, a long, agonizing shriek of rusted hinges, sounded like a trumpet blast in the quiet night. I slipped inside, pulling the door shut behind me. Immediate, absolute darkness. I flicked on my tactical headlamp, setting it to its lowest, dull red beam. The air inside was heavy, suffocating, a mix of old hay, mold, and bat droppings. Dust motes danced lazily in the weak light. The space was enormous. Hay bales stacked like silent sentinels, rusted farm implements that looked like instruments of torture, and a dizzying smell of decay. I located the trapdoor to the root cellar immediately. It was a slightly raised, square patch in the center of the dirt floor, covered by a stack of old tires. I started moving the tires slowly, one by one. I was halfway through when the hair on my arm stood up. I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from the far end of the barn near the grain silo. Scrape. It was the sound of leather dragging on dry wood, a footstep, maybe. Slow and deliberate. I froze, killing my headlamp immediately. The darkness slammed down again. My heart hammered against my ribs so loud I was sure it could be heard across the field. Was it a tramp? A squatter? Or had someone else heard the rumor? I waited, holding my breath, straining to hear anything over the frantic pulse in my ears. Silence. Absolute, heavy, terrifying silence. I decided it had to be a raccoon or the shifting of the old wood. This place was supposed to be empty. I cautiously flicked my red light back on, keeping the beam aimed down. I finished moving the tires and knelt by the trapdoor. It was secured by a heavy, modern-looking padlock, not the antique one on the main door. That's when I noticed the mud. It was on the lip of the trapdoor frame. Not the dry, dusty barn floor grime, but fresh, wet, sticky clay. The kind of mud I'd just been crawling through outside. And there were faint muddy smear marks leading from the front of the barn, past where I was kneeling, and continuing toward the silo. Someone had been here recently. Someone was in here now, or had been just moments ago. My plan changed instantly from a quick grab to a desperate scramble. I had to get this lock open and get down before I was found. I worked my picks fast and furious. The lock was complex, resisting my efforts. While I struggled, the silence broke again. This time it wasn't a scrape. It was a rhythmic drip, drip, drip coming from the dark shadow of the silo. And then a tiny, almost inaudible metallic chime. like a coin dropping onto cement. My hands stilled. I abandoned the lock and pressed my ear to the cold, splintered wood of the trapdoor. I listened for something that would tell me if the cellar was already breached. Nothing, just the muffled earth. I backed up slowly, pulling a small, heavy flashlight from my pocket, my only weapon. I aimed the bright beam toward the silo, ignoring my instinct to stay in the dark. The beam cut through the air, highlighting a shocking scene. Stacked neatly against the base of the silo were 6 new, military-grade ammunition crates. They were stamped with faded military stencils, and they definitely hadn't been there in the 60s. And lying next to the crates was a small pile of something that glinted in the light, spent 9mm shell casings. Dozens of them. Then I saw the man. He was sitting on an overturned bucket, his head tipped back against the curve of the silo wall. He was wearing clean denim and a dark jacket. His face was pale, his eyes open, staring sightlessly at the high rafters. He was dead. Very recently. A dark pool had soaked into the dirt floor around him, slowly spreading out from a massive, ugly hole in his chest. The drip, drip, drip I'd heard wasn't water. It was blood hitting the dirt from a gaping wound in the silo wall behind his head. The metallic chime must have been a dropped shell casing. He had a heavy caliber pistol lying loosely in his lap, and his right hand was outstretched, still gripping something small and shiny. I crept forward, my light fixed on the corpse. The fear was a cold, sharp thing, but the terror was mixed with the awful, sickening curiosity of the discovery. I reached the body and squatted down. The small, shiny object in his dead, cold hand was a key. A simple, heavy brass key, the kind that opens an old wooden door. But on the key's loop, etched crudely into the metal, was a single, unmistakable symbol, the inverted triangle, the same one I'd read about in the journals of Story 4. I snatched the key, my fingers recoiling from the cold skin of the corpse. Suddenly a loud, flat thud echoed from the loft directly above my head. My heart leaped into my throat. The killer was still here. I swung the beam up wildly. The loft was just a dark hole, full of cobwebs and shadows. I saw nothing, but the thud had been real. A heavy, definite step. I scrambled back toward the trapdoor. I wasn't leaving without those weapons, not now. The dead man was clearly here for the same reason. I threw my weight against the heavy tires, kicking them back over the trapdoor to hide it, then ran to the opposite side of the barn, near the main entrance. I shoved the key into the smallest, dirtiest lock I could find, the one on the rusted gear shed. It fit perfectly. I twisted the key, opened the shed, and jammed myself inside, pulling the thin wooden door shut. It was a tiny, cramped space, full of old shovels and oil cans, but it was cover. I crouched, holding my breath, listening. The only sound was the wind groaning through the broken ventilation slats in the main barn. Then from the loft came a sound of slow, heavy footsteps descending a wooden ladder. Creak, pause, creak. I heard the footsteps land on the dirt floor, right where I had found the dead man. The person was moving slowly, cautiously, their boots scuffing the dirt. Then the scuffing stopped. A low voice, deep and gravelly, sliced through the air. "He's got the key, and he didn't check the lockbox." The voice wasn't directed at me, it was directed at the dead man. Then the voice raised slightly, cutting through the silence. "You should have left when you heard the door scream, partner. Now, I'm gonna find you. And when I do, you tell me why Reddick's key is more important than the box he left." I pressed myself against a stack of cold, rusty shovels, the key burning a hole in my palm. The barn was huge, but this shed was tiny. He would check it eventually. I had the key to something, but not the root cellar, and the dead man was looking for a box. I knew I had maybe 30 seconds before the search reached my corner. I slowly, silently lifted one of the heavy, pointed shovels. I was trapped in the cold, dark countryside night, holding a key that belonged to a dead man, hiding from a killer who was looking for a box and knew exactly where I'd entered. The footsteps started moving again, slow and measured, coming closer to my hiding place. What was in the lockbox? And why did the dead man choose to hide with the key in his hand instead of running? The rain was an absolute, blinding misery. It had been since the moment the truck veered off the slick clay road. The accident wasn't my fault, not really. The old logging trailer had jackknifed across the bend, but the outcome was undeniably mine. And now the proof of my terrible night was 100 feet away, wrapped in a tarp and waiting for the earth to swallow it. My heart was a cold, frantic bird trapped in my chest. I was miles from anywhere, deep in the sticky, cypress-filled Louisiana swamp country, and it was 3 a.m. The air was thick with the smell of wet mud, decay, and the metallic tang of fear. I had found this abandoned cabin hours ago, a rotten, leaning structure built on stilts, probably for duck hunters. It was my base. My goal was simple: get the body into the ground before sunrise. I started digging near the back of the cabin, in a small, relatively dry patch of pine needles. The spade was cheap aluminum, and the ground was unforgiving, heavy, root-choked clay. Every shovelful was an exhausting, waterlogged torment. I dug for what felt like an eternity, fueled by coffee and pure, panicked adrenaline. My mind kept trying to scream, "Stop, leave, drive away and forget it." But I knew I couldn't. I couldn't live with the consequences, and I certainly couldn't live with the memory of the body found on the roadside. I finally reached about 3 feet deep. The hole was messy, irregular, and already filling with muddy water. It was enough. I leaned on the shovel, gasping for breath, the lantern light shaking wildly in my slick, trembling hands. That's when my light beam caught something unnatural sticking out of the wall of the grave. It wasn't a root or a rock. It was a fragment of bone. I dropped to my knees, scraping the mud away with the edge of the shovel. It was a piece of femur, pale and unnervingly smooth. And as I dug deeper into the side of my new grave, I found more. A piece of threadbare fabric, the distinct curve of a skull fragment, and a rusty, heavily oxidized brass button. My stomach heaved. The terror was overwhelming. I wasn't digging a new grave. I was disturbing an old one. This place, this isolated, forgotten patch of earth, was already claimed. I looked wildly around the swampy clearing. Was this why the cabin was abandoned? Was this some decades-old family plot? Or something worse? I scrambled out of the muddy hole, trying to wipe the sickening dirt and bone fragments off my gloves. I looked at the dark tarp lying under the cabin's porch, where my terrible burden waited. I couldn't put it in there. I just couldn't. I snatched up the lantern and ran inside the cabin, slamming the warped door shut. The small, single room was cold and smelled of dust and damp wood. I sank onto the floor, trying to quiet my ragged breathing. I had to think. The sun was an hour or two away. I had to find a new spot. As my eyes adjusted to the lantern light, they swept across the walls. The cabin was empty, except for one thing: a rough, hand-drawn map tacked to the inner side of the chimney flue. It wasn't a map of the land. It was a detailed drawing of the cabin structure, its foundation, and the surrounding clearing. And in the spot where I'd just been digging, the drawing had a small, neat X marked in faded ink. Under the X was one word: sleeping. I stared at the map, cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. Someone knew about the grave. Someone had drawn this map. The person who built this cabin? The person who buried the first body? I heard a faint, deliberate sound from outside, right beneath the floorboards, the sound of wood scraping on metal. I froze, gripping the handle of the lantern until my knuckles were white. The cabin was built on stilts. Someone was underneath it. Then, a low, wet whisper floated up through a gap in the rotting floorboards. It was too quiet to distinguish words, just a breathy, drawn-out sigh sound. I backed slowly away from the center of the floor, my eyes fixed on the gap. My mind, already fractured by the accident and the discovery of the old remains, was spinning wildly. Was this a person? Or was it the man sleeping outside, finally disturbed by my digging? I reached the small, grimy window and peered out into the rain. I held the light close, trying not to let the beam escape. The clearing was empty. The rain was still coming down in sheets. But then I saw a tiny shift in the shadows. 50 feet away, beneath the massive, gnarled branches of a dead cypress, was a subtle movement. A dark, upright shape, perfectly still, perfectly facing the cabin. It wasn't moving to approach. It was just standing there, watching the cabin. Watching me. I dropped into a low crouch behind an upturned bucket, killing the lantern. The world vanished into suffocating blackness, interrupted only by the frantic pounding of my heart. The person under the cypress wasn't waiting for me to leave. They were watching to see what I would do with the second body. I had stumbled into a place where death was buried, and the living came to monitor the silence. And then, from underneath the floorboards, came the sound again. louder this time. Not a whisper, a heavy, rhythmic scraping. Scrape, scrape. It was the sound of a shovel, my shovel, being dragged across the dirt under the cabin. Why would the person outside be watching while the person inside was moving my shovel? I realized my mistake. When I ran inside, I'd left the shovel resting against the porch. The person under the cypress must have sent their partner to retrieve it, maybe to finish the job for me. My window of opportunity was closing. I had to get the body in the truck and get out. I crept back toward the door, my bare hands searching the wall for the rusty axe I'd seen earlier. My fingers closed around the cold, slick wood of the handle. I braced myself against the door. I had to use the body as a distraction. I had to move faster than the killer standing guard and the person underneath me. I threw the deadbolt, yanked the door open, and burst out into the storm, letting out a wordless scream of panic and fury. I ran straight for the tarp-wrapped body, dodging the rainwater and the treacherous mud, ignoring the dark figure under the cypress. As I reached the porch, a voice finally broke the silence, cutting through the rain from the darkness near the cypress tree. Not a whisper, but a harsh, male shout. "He's moving the bundle! Get him! Leave the hole!" I seized the tarp, pulling the heavy, wet bundle with a massive surge of desperate strength, dragging it toward the road. I didn't look back. I just ran, leaving the cabin, the old grave, and the people who guarded it all behind me in the terrifying, endless night. The cold was the first thing that got to me, always. That deep, bone-aching dampness that only settles in the Pacific Northwest forests after the sun goes down in late November. I was already miles off the main gravel road, the tires of my old pickup spitting stones as I drove deeper into the valley. The engine was whining, protesting the steep climb to Old Man Hemlock's property. He'd called me an hour before, frantic. A storm was coming, the kind that snaps power lines and washes out roads, and his main cattle fence, the one that keeps his prize bull Goliath from wandering into the state forest, had been torn to pieces. Hemlock is pushing 85 and lives alone. I'm the only young guy in the valley, so when he calls, I go. I cut the engine when I reached the sagging split-rail gate. Absolute silence slammed into me, broken only by the sound of the wind beginning to hiss through the giant furse and the clicking of the cooling metal under the hood. I killed the headlights. Have you ever been in true, utter darkness? Not city dark, where there's still the orange glow of streetlights reflected off the clouds. This was a suffocating, pitch-black void, the kind of dark that makes your eyes water because your brain keeps trying to find something to focus on. I grabbed my tools, a thermos of black coffee, and my biggest, heaviest-duty LED floodlight. The light beam cut a stark, yellow-white swath across the muddy yard. The air smelled of wet pine needles, decay, and something else, something metallic and sharp like fresh blood, or maybe just machinery grease. Hemlock was waiting for me on the porch, a shaky silhouette holding a lantern that did little more than confirm the existence of the shadows. "Took you long enough, boy," he rasped, his voice tight. "Goliath's long gone. He'll be gored by a bear before morning. We'll find him, Hemlock. Where's the break?" "Down by the creek line. The big oak fell last week, and I figured I'd fix the line, but I guess I didn't tension it right. Go straight down through the meadow. You can't miss it." I nodded and started walking. The ground was already soaked, the mud sucking at my boots. The light felt like a lifeline, a thin string connecting me to sanity in this overwhelming country night. I followed the fence line, a trail of snapped wire and broken posts. It wasn't just old age, something heavy had hit this fence, hard. It looked less like an oak had brushed it, and more like a truck had plowed right through. This is where the fear started to curdle in my stomach. Hemlock is tough, but he's old and forgetful. Maybe he just didn't see the full extent of the damage. But as I walked, I kept finding things that didn't make sense. First, it was the skid marks. Not the long, gentle trails you'd expect from a cow or a bull. These were deep, straight gouges in the wet earth, like heavy, rubber-tired wheels had spun hard, trying to get traction. Then, about 100 feet before the actual break in the fence, I found the glove. It was cheap leather, the kind you buy in a 3-pack at the hardware store. It was lying half buried in the mud next to a thick post, and it was stiff with something dark. I didn't need to shine the light on it for long to know it wasn't mud. It was dried blood. A lot of it. I straightened up, heart hammering against my ribs. What the hell had Hemlock not told me? A gored bear? That would explain the blood, maybe, but not the deep tire tracks. Goliath was a bull, a big one, but bulls don't drive trucks. I scanned the forest edge, the light beam jumping nervously. The trees here were a solid wall of black, their tops swaying violently in the rising wind. Every shadow looked like it was detaching itself from the trunk, shifting, watching. I pushed on, trying to tell myself the blood was from the bull. Maybe Goliath had torn himself up on the wire. When I reached the actual break, the scene froze me in place. The fence post wasn't just broken. It was snapped cleanly in half, the jagged end pointing toward the sky. The wires were splayed out like broken spider silk. The gap was wide enough for Goliath, sure, but it was what lay right in the middle of the gap that made my blood run cold. It was a small, canvas duffel bag, the kind that holds camping gear, or maybe clothes. It was zipped shut, wet and muddy, but what caught my attention was the smell. The metallic scent I'd noticed earlier was overpowering here, mingling with a sharp, sweet odor that I recognized immediately from working on farms. Caustic soda. I knelt down, my hand shaking as I picked up the bag. It was heavy, too heavy for clothes. It felt dense, like it was packed with rocks, or something solid and unnatural. I felt a sudden, desperate urge to throw the bag into the creek and run, but a greater, sicker curiosity kept my fingers glued to the zipper. I didn't open it, not yet. I just held the bag, turning my light over the muddy ground around the break, and then I saw the footprints. They weren't Goliath's huge, distinctive hooves. These were work boots, size 11, maybe 12, and there were several sets. They led directly from the deep tire tracks, through the broken fence, and then stopped right at the edge of the forest. And they never came back out. My stomach plummeted. This wasn't a runaway bull. This was something else. This was what the local news had been talking about for 3 weeks. A missing hiker named Jeremy Silas, last seen near the national forest boundary, just over this ridge. The police had searched for days, found nothing, and called it a tragic accident. I looked at the bag in my hands, then at the forest where the footprints ended. A knot of terror cinched tight in my chest. If this was connected to Silas, then the people who left those prints were either still out there, or they were long gone, and this bag was a message, or a clue, or worse. I decided, stupidly, to track the prints. I couldn't just leave it, not with the blood and the lye smell and the missing man haunting the valley. I zipped up my jacket, switched my light to its highest beam, and stepped over the broken fence line into the total black of the woods. The forest immediately swallowed the light. It wasn't flat ground anymore. It was a steep, chaotic slope of slippery moss, tangled roots, and thorny brush. The wind was a solid roar now, shaking the branches above me and raining down water drops that felt like cold, wet taps on my neck. I followed the footprints for maybe 50 yards. They were getting fainter now, disturbed by the wind and the falling needles. The duffel bag, still heavy and ominous, was swinging against my thigh. Then the prints stopped. Just stopped. As if the people who made them had suddenly been lifted into the air. I swung the light wildly, panic beginning to tighten my breath. I was deep in the woods, no cell service, miles from Hemlock, who was deaf as a post anyway. I was alone with a bag that stank of chemicals and a terrifying mystery. I shone the light straight up. Nothing but the black canopy swaying. I shone it down, around, in every direction. Nothing. Except for one thing. Tucked between the roots of a massive ancient cedar, half hidden by a clump of ferns, was a small plastic water bottle. It looked brand new, the kind that expensive gyms hand out. It wasn't the kind of trash you'd find miles deep in the backcountry. And taped to the side, neatly and clearly, was a single laminated strip of paper. I crouched down, the heavy duffel bag slipping from my grasp and thudding softly onto the moss. I had to peel the wet ferns away to read the tiny black printed text. It wasn't a note. It was a single cryptic instruction. Check the well. They're waiting. I read it twice. My mind scrambled, trying to make sense of the they and the waiting. Was this a prank? A sick joke? A warning? Hemlock's place didn't have a well. It had a spring box behind the barn. But about a quarter-mile further down, past the old lumber mill foundation, was the abandoned Miller property. They had a well, a deep one dug in the 1920s, covered by a loose wooden lid. I didn't hesitate this time. The note, the blood, the lie, the tracks that disappeared, it all clicked into a horrific, dangerous narrative. Someone had done something terrible, and they were trying to tell me where the evidence was, or maybe where I was supposed to go next. I snatched up the duffel bag and started running back toward the fence line. I didn't care about Goliath anymore. I didn't care about Hemlock. My only goal was to get to the Miller well before I was seen. I burst through the broken fence, stumbling out into the meadow. The relief of being out of the close-pressing woods was immense, but it was immediately replaced by a fresh, paralyzing dread. The faint yellow light I'd left on in my truck's cab was still there, but something was wrong. The driver's side door was open. I froze, 50 yards away, my breath sawing raggedly in the cold air. I knew I had locked it. I always lock it, even up here. I dropped into a low crouch, pulling the heavy metal wrench from my tool bag. I kept the light off, letting the intense blackness cover me. I strained my ears, trying to hear anything over the wind that was now screaming through the valley. Snick. It was a small sound, an almost imperceptible one. It sounded like metal sliding against metal, like a switchblade being opened. My heart was beating so hard it felt like it was rattling my teeth. I could see a dark shape moving around the front of my truck, slow and deliberate. It wasn't Hemlock. Hemlock couldn't move like that. I needed a distraction. I needed to know if they were alone. I lobbed the heavy duffel bag, the bag I hadn't opened, the one smelling of lye, as hard as I could, aiming for the far side of the barn. It hit the corrugated metal siding with a loud, sickening thwack, the sound echoing huge and distorted in the valley. The dark shape by the truck snapped its head toward the sound. For just a split second, I saw the reflection of the porch light in something hard and flat. Sunglasses. At night. That was all the confirmation I needed. This was professional. This was the nightmare. I didn't wait. I turned and sprinted back toward the forest line, but not toward the broken fence. I ran parallel to the fence, heading toward the old mill road that led to the Miller property and the well. I heard a shout, muffled by the wind, and then the sound of heavy running footsteps pounding the muddy ground. They were following me. They didn't want the bag. They wanted me. I didn't look back. I plunged into the dark forest again, ignoring the tearing brush and the slipping roots. My lungs were burning, the cold air scraping against the inside of my throat. I ran for 5 minutes that felt like 5 hours. I finally burst out onto the overgrown mill road, my boots splashing into deep, cold puddles. Up ahead, through a gap in the trees, I could see the slumped silhouette of the old Miller farmhouse, and next to it, the faint, moss-covered wooden circle of the well cover. I had to get to that well. But why? I risked a glance behind me. 2 figures were silhouetted briefly against the yellow light of Hemlock's farm, now a distant beacon. They were moving fast, not searching, but hunting. I reached the well, hands tearing at the loose planks that covered the opening. They were heavy, soaked with decades of rain. I managed to kick one away and heave the other. The smell that rose from the black, stagnant air of the well shaft was thick, chemical, and unmistakable, a stronger, sicker concentration of the same lye smell from the duffel bag. I shined my light down. The beam cut through the darkness, hitting the surface of the water maybe 20 feet down, and then I saw it. Floating just below the surface, half submerged, was a coil of thick, plasticized rope, and tied to the rope, just barely visible, was a heavy, shapeless mass wrapped in a tattered blue tarp. That's when I understood what was in the duffel bag. Tools. The lye, the rope, the things needed to make a man disappear. And the well wasn't the clue. It was the dump site. "He's at the well!" A voice roared from the road behind me, much closer this time. I didn't have time to react. I heard the sickening whoosh of air and felt a searing pain explode across the back of my skull. The world tilted violently, the light in my hand dropping and rolling away, its beam spinning like a drunk searchlight across the trees. I collapsed onto the muddy ground, a high-pitched ringing replacing the sound of the wind. I felt a boot kick me hard in the ribs, driving the air from my lungs in a painful rush. A rough hand grabbed the collar of my jacket and hauled me upright, my face inches from the black, gaping hole of the well. I looked up into the face of the man who had hit me. He He wasn't wearing sunglasses anymore. He was young, clean-shaven, and his eyes were flat and empty. "What did the note say?" he hissed, his breath hot and ragged against my ear. "Tell me exactly what was on the damn tape." "I don't know," I managed, the lie tasting like blood. He smiled, a terrible, thin-lipped crescent. "Wrong answer." He drove his fist into my jaw. I felt the bone crack, a sharp, exquisite burst of pain. I fell back, rolling on the ground, my arms instinctively wrapping around my head. "We knew someone would find the break," another voice said, quieter, colder. This one sounded older, more in control. "We just didn't expect a good Samaritan. Now, where's the bag you threw?" I heard the click-clack of a slide being pulled back on a pistol. The sounds of the countryside, the wind, the rattling branches, the distant, mournful lowing of Goliath, suddenly seemed very far away. "You've been helping Hemlock all your life, haven't you?" the older man asked, his voice almost conversational, as if asking about the weather. "Good boy. Now tell me what you read, and we'll leave your old neighbor out of it. We just need to know if we've been compromised." My vision was swimming. I knew this was the end. I was minutes, seconds away from being the second body to join Jeremy Silas in that cold black water. But then I had a thought, a final, desperate, terrifying gamble. I took a shaky breath. "It didn't say to check the well," I whispered, forcing the words out through the pain. It said the creek is poisoned. Call the sheriff. It's a biohazard." The silence that followed was instant and absolute. The man with the gun froze. The younger one stopped breathing. "A biohazard?" the older man repeated, his composure finally cracking. "What the hell does that mean? What did Silas leave behind?" "Silas. I was right, the missing hiker." "I don't know," I said, putting everything I had left into sounding scared and truthful. "But he wrote the note on a syringe box, said the creek water would kill the cattle by morning. That's why I ran. I thought I had to warn Hemlock." I knew I had bought myself a moment, a tiny window of fear and confusion. They were professionals, maybe disposing of a body, but they weren't expecting a biological threat or the involvement of the authorities. The older man swore viciously. "Check the truck! He had to have called someone." The younger man turned instantly and ran back toward the road. This was it. I didn't wait for the older man to turn his attention back to me. I rolled over, ignoring the screaming pain in my ribs and head, and lunged toward the well, using the massive, rotting lid plank as cover. I heard the gunshot a split second before I felt the heat and the spray of mud next to my ear. The noise was deafening in the still air. I kicked out, catching the plank and sending it skittering across the muddy ground toward the man. It wasn't to hit him, it was to make him flinch. He did. In that tiny, half-second hesitation, I grabbed the heavy, moss-covered stone used to anchor the well lid and threw it into the dark shaft with all my remaining strength. It hit the water with a massive, echoing kerplunk, a sound that boomed out into the black night. Then, I turned and sprinted, not toward the road, but away from it, deeper into the forest toward the ridgeline. The second gunshot ripped past me, high and wild. The last thing I heard before the trees swallowed me whole was the frantic, cold voice of the older man screaming into the darkness. "He's gone! Get the bag and call the others! We have to burn everything!" I ran until my lungs felt like they were tearing apart. I ran until the sounds of the farm and the gunshots were replaced only by the roar of the wind and the pounding in my ears. I ran, a simple valley farm boy, deep into the black wilderness with a broken jaw and the terrifying knowledge of what lay hidden in the cold, muddy ground of the countryside. I never did find Goliath, but I found something far, far worse. And now, out here, alone in the total dark, the only question that mattered wasn't how I would get away, but how many others the others were, and how long I had before they realized the biohazard was just a desperate lie. The rain had turned the county road into a small river. I'd watched the last truck try to cross the low-water bridge at 7 p.m. It stalled halfway and had to be pulled out. That meant I was officially trapped. My boss, Mr. Sterling, was 100 miles away in the city, and I, the weekend house-sitter, was alone in his modern glass-walled fortress until the creek went down, probably late tomorrow. It was 11:30 p.m. The house was enormous, full of uncomfortable modernist furniture, and the constant drip of the severe rain beating against the large, unprotected windows. I was in the kitchen, reading, when the main power grid failed. The house went from sterile white light to absolute blackness. I didn't panic. I knew where the flashlight was. I got the lamp, and a few minutes later, the generator kicked in with a groan, bathing the house in a dim, temporary yellowish light. It wasn't the strong, confident light of the grid. It was fragile, flickering, and weak. I checked the doors. Locked. The security system was armed, motion sensors at the perimeter, but the loud alarm tone would only sound if a window or door was actually opened. I went back to the kitchen, trying to ignore the way the shadows clung to the high ceilings. That's when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the storm, the generator, or the rain. It was a faint, sharp clink, like metal touching porcelain. It came from upstairs in the master bedroom suite. My stomach dropped. I hadn't been upstairs since I checked the locks at 6 p.m. I knew for a fact the house was empty. I froze, listening over the rattling of the windows. Nothing. Just the generator sighing outside. Was it the wind? A heavy branch hitting the house? The house was solid, concrete and steel. Branches wouldn't sound like metal on porcelain. I grabbed the thick, heavy iron fireplace poker from the hearth. I took a deep, shaky breath, switched the weak flashlight to a low beam, and started up the floating wooden stairs. The stairs creaked slightly under my weight. The sound felt deafening. I reached the master bedroom level and crept down the hall. The generator light barely reached this far, leaving the corners draped in oppressive shadows. I reached the master door. It was slightly ajar. I knew I had closed it. I nudged the door open with my boot, my heart hammering against my ribs. I swept the small beam of the flashlight across the enormous room. The bed was undisturbed. The large, minimalist desk was empty. Everything seemed normal, except for one thing. A small white vase that sat on the corner of the dresser was now lying on the polished wood floor, shattered. That was the clink I'd heard. I stepped into the room, scanning the deep walk-in closet and the bathroom. Empty. I knelt to pick up a shard of porcelain. Why would a burglar waste time breaking a cheap vase? Unless they were searching for something small. I looked down at the dresser. It was a massive 6-drawer unit. 5 of the drawers were closed. The 3rd drawer down, however, was wide open. I shined the light inside. It was full of Mr. Sterling's neatly folded handkerchiefs and expensive cufflink boxes. I noticed immediately that the contents had been sifted through. The handkerchiefs were ruffled, the cufflink boxes slightly ajar. This wasn't a random smash and grab. They weren't after electronics or cash. They were looking for something small, hidden in a sock drawer, something they hadn't found yet. Then I heard a sound directly behind me. Not a clink this time, a soft, wet shush, like someone pulling a wet cloth across glass. I spun around, poker raised. My flashlight beam bounced off the large window that overlooked the orchards. And there, pressed against the glass, just inches from my face, was a hand. A large, gloved hand, moving slowly, deliberately, wiping the condensation away from the glass. The figure in the gloom outside was massive, obscured by the rain and the weak generator light. But they were there. They were outside, watching me. Wait, the house was sealed. The motion detectors weren't going off. I remembered the creek. The whole area was flooded. I looked at the window again. The hand was moving, drawing a crude circle in the condensation. Then I saw the small, dark object pressed against the glass, right where the hand had cleared a circle. It was a pair of powerful binoculars. I had been inside the house for 10 minutes with a broken vase, and the intruder was outside, watching my every move. They hadn't broken in. They were waiting for me to leave. The sudden realization of the truth was terrifying. The clink I heard wasn't the intruder entering. It was the intruder signaling that they had reached the window, maybe trying to draw me out. They wanted me to think they were inside, distracted, while they waited for me to make a mistake. I backed up slowly, silently. I had to assume they had a partner who had broken the vase and was now somewhere else in the house. I reached the hall, and without turning the light back on, I began to crawl toward the back staircase. As I moved, a loud, piercing tone split the air. Not the alarm. It was the phone. It was the satellite phone in the downstairs study, ringing shrilly. I stopped breathing. Who would call the satellite phone at this hour? Only Mr. Sterling, or someone else who knew the main lines were down. The phone rang a second time, and then a third. The sound covered the entire house. It was a beacon. It was telling the person outside and the person, maybe inside, exactly where the target was. I knew Sterling kept his most sensitive documents, the ones he always talked about keeping off the network, in a floor safe under the study rug. The phone call was drawing me straight to the safe. Was the person outside calling the phone to force me to the safe? Was the person inside going to ambush me when I answered? The phone stopped ringing. The silence that followed was heavy and expectant. I heard a floorboard creak, faint but definite, from the living room below me. I crept to the top of the stairs, the poker tight in my grip. I looked down into the shadowy expanse of the living area. I saw a figure standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminated briefly by a flash of lightning. They were tall, bulky, and moving with a terrifying, fluid stillness. They weren't looking at the front door. They were looking at the floor in the corner of the study, right where the safe was. I knew what they were doing. They weren't waiting for me to answer the phone. They were waiting for me to move the rug. I was trapped between the man at the window and the man in the house, both of whom knew I was alone, and both of whom knew the exact location of the item they wanted. I quietly turned, ignoring the figure downstairs, and ran for the master bedroom closet. The heavy poker felt small and useless in my hand. My only hope was to find a weapon, or another exit. I closed the closet door and braced against it, my light beam sweeping wildly. I didn't find a gun. I found a small, heavy box tucked into the back of a shelf. I grabbed it, my fingers fumbling with the latch, and as I opened it, I heard a terrible sound from downstairs, the violent, ripping sound of a rug being yanked off a floor. I looked down at the box in my hands. It wasn't cash. It wasn't jewelry. It was a single, expensive black satellite phone, identical to the one downstairs. The phone I heard ringing wasn't Sterling's phone. It was an identical ringer used to lure me. The real satellite phone was in my hands. The light downstairs flickered wildly as the generator stuttered and coughed. I had the means to call for help, but the lights were dying, and the intruder was seconds away from finding the empty safe. How long before the intruder realizes the floor safe is empty and that the only other satellite phone, the real target, is still in my hands? The mountain wasn't just cold, it was predatory. The high-altitude wind was a physical thing, clawing at the metal chassis of my snowmobile as I lay tangled in the drift. My emergency flare had burned out 10 minutes ago, leaving me in a darkness so profound it felt solid. The only sound was the shriek of the wind and the high, thin ringing in my ears. I had been running late, taking the shortcut over the old Aspen Ridge Pass, and I paid for it. The snowmobile was dead, the radio was useless, and my body was starting to lose the fight against the sub-zero air. I knew I had maybe an hour before I simply stopped moving. I had to find shelter. I dragged myself up the remaining 50 feet of slope, guided by the faint, geometric shadow of the old switch house. It was a small, concrete block structure built decades ago to manage power distribution for a now-defunct mining operation. It was supposed to be empty, disused, and unlocked. I reached the rusted steel door and hit it hard with the heel of my boot. It groaned open, revealing a small, black space that smelled of ozone, mice, and cold concrete. It was barely warmer than outside, but it was out of the wind. That was everything. I fumbled with my last match, lighting a small, stubby candle I found in my jacket pocket. The weak light revealed the interior, a single room full of heavy, dust-covered circuit breakers, thick ceramic insulators, and a concrete floor. I moved to the back wall, huddling against the cold cement, trying to slow my breathing. That's when I noticed the anomaly. Running along the floor where the main power lines should have entered the building were two thick, heavily insulated, non-standard cables. They weren't attached to the old junction box. They ran straight across the floor, through a newly drilled hole in the far wall, and out into the howling, pitch-black night. Why would anyone run new power lines out of a disused utility building and straight up the back of the mountain? I tracked the cables to the hole. The concrete around the entry point was fresh, disturbed. Someone had been working here recently, and they were using this remote, dead facility as a base of operations. My mind, already dulled by the cold, struggled with the implication. This wasn't just shelter, it was someone's secret staging ground. I stood up, the candle shaking in my hand, and looked out the single small wire mesh window. The fog of my breath immediately covered the glass, but I wiped a patch clear with my sleeve. The mountain was a void of darkness, but far up the ridge line, where the mysterious cables were leading, I saw it. A faint, intermittent flash of pale blue light. It wasn't a constant beam. It was a rhythmic pulse. Flash, pause, flash, pause. Too regular to be natural, too blue to be a cabin light. It was coming from maybe a mile away, right at the crest of the ridge. What were they powering up there, and why the pulse? I was about to turn away when the light pulsed again, and this time, the reflection of the blue beam caught something on the windowsill inside the shack. It was a small, circular metal object. I picked it up. It was a key fob, the kind used to wirelessly unlock a vehicle. It was clean, modern, and warm to the touch. It had just been used. I spun around. The shack was tiny, no place to hide. But the key fob meant the person who used this place, the person running those cables, was near. I immediately shone the candlelight into every corner. And then I saw the floor. Against the far wall, where the new cables exited, the concrete slab was slightly discolored, darker than the rest. And in the center of the dark spot, there was a tiny, glinting piece of metal sticking up. I knelt, using the key fob to pry the metal edge. It lifted, revealing a small, brass trapdoor about 8 inches square. I pulled the door open. Below was a dark, narrow chute, maybe 4 feet deep, just wide enough to drop a box down. It wasn't a root cellar. It looked like a hidden delivery drop box. I held the candle over the opening. The chute was empty, except for a thin, single sheet of folded paper stuck to the bottom with packing tape. I pulled it free, my hands trembling with cold and fear. It was a typed note, printed in a clean, small font. The power test is complete. The package is now active. Drop must be retrieved before sunrise. They know the rhythm. I read the note twice. The package is active. They know the rhythm. I looked back at the window. The blue light pulsed again, slow and methodical from the ridge. That was the rhythm. And then I heard a sound from outside. Not the wind. The clear, mechanical whine of a snowmobile engine starting up close by, right behind the shack. The person was here. They had just activated their package on the ridge, and they were here to retrieve their delivery. I scrambled away from the trapdoor, running to the far corner and flattening myself against the cold wall. I killed the candle, plunging the shack into instant, total blackness. I heard the heavy steel door of the shack grate open. The wind immediately roared in, bringing a blast of ice and snow. A dark figure stepped inside. They didn't turn on a light. They moved silently, confidently, directly toward the back wall. I could hear the soft, rhythmic crunch of their boots on the concrete floor, getting closer to my position. I reached for the only weapon I had, a short, heavy section of insulated copper cable lying beneath the old breaker box. The figure reached the exit hole where the cables ran out. They paused, bending down. In the sudden, total silence, the figure said, in a calm, flat voice, barely a whisper, "You shouldn't have turned off the light. We need to see who's hiding." The figure straightened up and began walking, not toward the back wall, but straight toward the section of floor where I was hiding. I realized my mistake, the key fob. I must have pressed the panic button or the lock button when I picked it up, and the person outside heard it. The fob was warm because they had just come in to retrieve it. They were closing the gap, their silhouette barely visible against the faint outside snow glow. They stopped 3 feet away. How did they know I was there in the darkness? And what was the package on the ridge that was now active? And why did they fear that they knew the rhythm? I raised the heavy copper cable over my head, knowing that in seconds I would be facing whatever dangerous secret this icy mountain pass was hiding.